Every scandal has an origin point, and Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor's might have been predicted long before the world ever paid attention. Two women, separated by more than 40 years, describe him with almost identical words: entitled, reckless, and certain that consequences were for other people. Their stories don't just overlap, they lock together, exposing a pattern that followed him from his early 20s to the moment his public life collapsed. And once you hear what they revealed, you may see his downfall in a way that makes it clear none of this was sudden, none of it was unexpected. It was written in his behavior from the very beginning. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next.
Susanna Constantine didn't hesitate when asked whether Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor was misunderstood. She immediately called him ignorant, entitled, and convinced the world owed him something. No pause, no softening, a direct character assessment from someone who once moved comfortably inside his social circle. And that speed raises a sharper question. What did she see that made her so certain? She recalled moments where he would erupt over something minor, shouting, swearing, or turning on people without warning. Not pressure, not stress, just instinct. These weren't isolated reactions, they were habits. And if this is how he behaved around acquaintances, how did he act around people who couldn't push back? Then Constantine mentioned something that grabbed even more attention: his helicopter license. She described how brutally difficult the process is, noting that her own son had to fight through every step. Yet somehow, Andrew sailed through it with ease. Her implication was sharp. Certain opportunities weren't earned, they were arranged. Which leads to the next question. If he was pushed through that door, how many others opened the same way? Even when she acknowledged the challenges of growing up as the spare, she immediately shut down the idea that privilege excuses behavior. She made it clear, upbringing may explain pressure, but it doesn't explain entitlement taken to extremes. And that point matters, because it suggests his actions weren't circumstantial, they were consistent. So consistent that it leaves us wondering, if this wasn't caused by his position, then what shaped it? And that brings us to the most revealing part. Susanna Constantine's comments sound new, but they aren't unique. Decades before she spoke, another woman saw the exact same traits: entitlement, impulsiveness, and a reckless disregard for consequence. And her warning didn't just describe his behavior, it predicted his future. Her name was Vicki Hodge, and what she said in the early 1980s now reads like a blueprint for everything that came next.
Susanna Constantine didn't stop at describing Andrew's temperament. She went deeper, suggesting his entire life operated on a system of shortcuts. Her example of the helicopter license wasn't random. It hinted at a much larger pattern. Rules that applied to everyone else simply didn't apply to him. And that raises a crucial question. How many doors stayed open only because of his last name, not his ability? This idea of privilege without accountability has followed Andrew for decades. Constantine's comments only reinforced what many insiders have quietly said for years. He expected advantages, accepted them instantly, and rarely considered the responsibility that came with them. But here's the real point. At what stage does privilege stop being an advantage and become a trap? Even the small moment of sympathy she offered, acknowledging the difficulty of being the spare, quickly vanished. She said that role may be challenging, but it doesn't justify the level of entitlement she witnessed firsthand. In other words, the issue wasn't his position, the issue was his mindset. And if it wasn't shaped by his upbringing, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How early did these traits actually appear? Because long before Constantine ever went public, another woman had already warned exactly where his behaviour would lead. Someone who met him when he was young, before titles, before scandals, before the world was paying attention, and her prediction wasn't vague. It was so specific that listening to it today feels almost unsettling.
More than 40 years before Susanna Constantine spoke out, actress and model Vicki Hodge met Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor in Barbados. She didn't know him, wasn't invested in him, and had no reason to exaggerate. Yet from their very first conversation, she noticed red flags that would sound familiar today. Her description wasn't dramatic, it was observational. And that's exactly what makes it so compelling. How did she see so much so quickly? Hodge recalled him firing off endless jokes he found hilarious, despite no one else laughing. It wasn't humor, it was self-admiration. She said he enjoyed the sound of his own voice more than the reaction he got from others. That small detail matters because it mirrors accounts from people who met him decades later. And it poses a bigger question. If strangers could spot these traits instantly, how long had they been there? The next day, she saw him again, this time swimming in the sea without a single stitch of clothing. No hesitation, no awareness, no boundaries. Just a young man acting as though the world behind him didn't exist. Her account didn't sensationalize it, she simply noted the behavior. But that one moment revealed something larger. He wasn't seeking attention, he expected it. Their brief 10-day romance only confirmed her instincts. She described him as immature, full of himself, and convinced of his own charm. He told her he loved her, then vanished the moment he sailed away. No call, no letter, nothing. Not heartbreak, but a pattern. Intensity without responsibility, interest without follow-through. Weeks later, Hodge told a reporter that he was headstrong and refused to take advice unless it suited him. She said he needed someone strong enough to stop him from getting into escapades that would embarrass himself and the entire family. At the time, it sounded like a warning from someone older and more experienced, but today that warning feels almost prophetic. How did she describe his future so accurately decades before it happened? Because everything she predicted, every trait she listed matched what staff, insiders, and former acquaintances would later say as his life unraveled. Her comments weren't dramatic, they were precise, and that precision makes the next part of the story even more telling. As the years passed, people who worked around Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor began sharing their own experiences, and what they described lined up almost perfectly with the warnings from both Susanna Constantine and Vicki Hodge. Former staff members spoke of sudden outbursts, sharp insults, and an attitude that shifted instantly from calm to furious. These weren't rare moments, they were routine. And that consistency sparks a critical question. How many similar incidents never made it past palace walls? Guests at private gatherings recalled a different side of him, one that relied on shock value. Several described crude jokes aimed at women, delivered not to entertain, but to provoke. Others remembered the way he treated social events as opportunities to test boundaries. It wasn't mischief, it wasn't humour, it was control disguised as playfulness. And that raises a deeper point. Was he pushing limits because he enjoyed the reaction, or because he thought nothing could touch him? Insiders say these behaviours appeared early and never faded. The stories changed locations, changed witnesses, changed decades, but the pattern stayed the same.
Whether he was in his 20s or his 50s, the same descriptions kept resurfacing: crude humour, impulsive decisions, and a complete lack of self-awareness. And that consistency leaves a single question hanging over everything. If warnings were this obvious, how long did people allow the behaviour to continue unchecked? These accounts weren't coming from enemies or critics. They came from staff, friends, and people who had nothing to gain by speaking out. And the fact that so many of their stories matched almost word for word suggests something important. The behaviour wasn't random. It was a long-standing pattern that only ever moved in one direction. And eventually, that pattern collided with reality in a way even he couldn't ignore. For years, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor moved through life with access, status, and a certainty that everything would work out in his favour. But that confidence collapsed almost overnight. Once accusations surfaced and global scrutiny intensified, every privilege that once protected him began to disappear. His titles were removed, his public role vanished, and he was pushed out of the spotlight he once relied on. It wasn't a gradual decline, it was a sudden drop that left no room for recovery, and it forces one unavoidable question: how much of this downfall was created by his own behaviour long before the world noticed? Pressure continued building behind palace walls. Reports say he's under constant push to leave Royal Lodge, the place he once viewed as his permanent sanctuary. The life he lived for decades, one defined by access, comfort, and unquestioned influence, has narrowed into something far smaller. And that shift highlights a truth his former acquaintances hinted at for years: a life built on privilege collapses quickly when the privilege disappears. What makes this story so compelling is how perfectly the accounts line up. Susanna Constantine's recent remarks match Vicki Hodge's warnings from the 1980s. Both mirror the stories told by staff, insiders, and guests who saw the same behaviours unfold across decades. Different eras, different witnesses, but almost identical descriptions. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. It reveals a pattern that followed him through every stage of his life, and ultimately shaped the ending he faces now. Today, Andrew has no titles, no public responsibilities, and a reputation overshadowed by controversy. New stories continue to surface from people who once knew him, each one reinforcing the same image. And the more these accounts emerge, the clearer the picture becomes. His collapse wasn't sudden at all. It was the final chapter of a pattern that had been building for years. Everything the public sees now, the isolation, the pressure, the fading influence, was predicted long before the world cared enough to listen. And if the accounts from Constantine and Hodge prove anything, it's this: his downfall didn't reveal who he became, it revealed who he had been all along.